So we passed by this, and I didn't mention anything, but I want you to see, there's this kind of row back here, and it's got a candle on it with flowers around it. So what's the deal there? There's a little kind of rope there that kind of looks like it restricts it. So one of the traditions here at the Naval Academy is that in the last row of every chapel, so that used to be the last row before it was expanded in the 30s, there is a row that's cordoned off. Nobody's allowed to sit there. They put a candle there, usually fresh flowers, and the candle is lit for every service. It's a memorial for prisoners of war and those missing in action. So no matter what happens, nobody sits there. And this place can get pretty crowded. Fire Marshal says a little over 2,000 people can come in here. So it's open to the public. So friends of mine come here for services. They have concerts here. So one of the awesome events, being near the Naval Academy has sports and everything, but also beautiful music and concerts and events that go on here that you get invited to, normally free of charge. The organist here, Monty Maxwell, is unbelievable. There's 5 different keyboard levels, over 500 stops, thousands of pipes, and about 15,000 different sounds you can make with the combination of the pipes and the digital. So when he's playing and practicing, the place it's just awesome. You can really get it rocking. So just an unbelievable place. So weddings and funerals here, you have to have some connection to the Naval Academy or be stationed here in the Navy to be able to get married. I always say that I'm glad I didn't have to get married here because my wife would have changed her mind. No, I'm just kidding. No way, she would have been thinking too much. Like, am I sure I want to do it? That's a long walk, right? I'm up there like, come on. But on a more serious note, the funerals here are also heart-wrenching. One of the more memorable ones a couple years ago, John McCain. So he had funeral services everywhere. His last one was right here, very private, although people in town kind of lined the streets when he came in. And then horse-drawn carriage took him to the Naval Academy Cemetery. So very powerful day here. So Naval Academy used to be mandatory that you had to go to service. Think about that. And then 1974, Vietnam era, some litigation, kind of saying First Amendment, that doesn't sound right. And so, but most of the students do take part in some kind of religious service, one way or the other, different levels, but even though it's not mandatory. Questions about the chapel? Cool place. All right, follow me. Watch your step, it's a quick drop. And a sticky door.
Thank you.
You bet. Watch your step coming down. And literally, you open the door. Yeah, and it's a shame because it's not always open, and I don't know. It's sometimes you just show up and it's closed for some random reason, and it's open except when it's not. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about leadership. So we're going to talk about Ernest Flagg designing this chapel, right? Pretty cool idea. Here was a crazy thing he did. When he designed the chapel, underneath the chapel, he built a crypt. And we talked about this guy a little bit earlier, a crypt for Revolutionary War hero John Paul Jones. And so we wanted to have his remains buried down there, except we didn't have his remains. In fact, we didn't even know where they were. So a quick story about John Paul Jones, born in Scotland. By the time he's 12, his family isn't very wealthy, so they said, you gotta kind of come up with something to do. So they said, you're gonna become a sailor, and so he goes to sea for 7 years. Not going to summer camp, no, he's sailing on the Atlantic for the next 7 years, when he's 12. So he becomes an amazingly good sailor, ends up settling here in America at that time, before the Revolutionary War. His brother was here, and then the Revolutionary War starts quickly thereafter, and John Paul Jones is like, sign me up, I'm up. So off he goes, and he's using his brains. He's a wonderful leader because he's like, what do I got? The British Navy is far superior to whatever we can cobble together here. So how can we beat them? We'll go small. So how do we do that? we go after the merchant ships. They're not as well guarded, they're smaller ships. I can go after them. Oh, and by the way, I can keep my crew motivated because we're privateers. When we capture those merchant ships, my crew and I get a cut of the loot. Good incentive program, yeah? We like that so far. So he's wildly successful, driving the British nuts. And I get the sense from reading about him that as he was successful, his ego kind of grew along with him. So then he comes up with this idea. Speaking of audacious ideas, he said, I'm going to go to France and I'm going to convince the French to join me in invading Great Britain. Right? Like, who's nuts enough to do that? He goes to France. It takes him a little while, but he actually is able to get together a flotilla of French ships who are kind of like going along with it. I don't think they were that enthusiastic. And off they sail. And they actually did land a couple of times on British soil, just enough to like scare the Brits and have them recall some big British warships. So that was a good thing. So he gets about 3/4 of the way around the British Isles and he runs into Nirvana for him. About 50 British merchant ships guarded by this big warship called the Serapis. John Paul Jones like, game on, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for my whole career. So he starts blasting away at the Serapis, and shortly thereafter, one of his cannon batteries blows up. So does he give up? No, he's creative. He's a creative leader. He's like, well, how can I beat him now? I got it. I'm going to sail right up next to him, tie up next to him, and then I'll take away that superior firepower and just go mano a mano with him. I got a shot that way. Otherwise, we're just going to die out here. So away they go. About halfway through the battle, the British captain, who knew it was John Paul Jones, is probably looking at him like, what the heck is this guy doing? So story goes that he calls over to the ship and essentially says, John Paul Jones, are you going to strike your colors? Are you going to, surrender? To which he famously replies, I have not yet begun to fight. Or words to that effect. He had a good marketing guy. We're not really sure that those words ever came out of his mouth. It may have been something more like, I'd rather swim than strike, but we'll go with, I have not yet begun to fight, because he's on a tear, right? So, darn if he doesn't win. So after the battle's over, he invites the British captain over. They have probably cocktails and dinner. That's the way they did it back then. And then at the end says, oh, thank you very much. Now I'm going to take your ship. So he takes over the Serapis. Thank goodness, because his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, sinks. So he sails it back to France. The people in France love him. Because, we weren't happy with the British, but we didn't hate them like the French did. The French really didn't like him. So any enemy of our enemy is our friend. Yeah, that's right. So they loved him. And then, so he stays in France for a while, and then the Revolutionary War ends, and we don't have a Navy. We specifically say we're not going to have a Navy, so he doesn't have a job. So what does he do? Goes to work for Catherine the Great. He's got some fight in him. Things didn't go too well for our friend and Catherine the Great. A little controversy, I'll just leave it at that. So he kind of quietly leaves the Russian Navy, comes back to France, and he dies. So what's the point of this story? So he dies in France. He's Protestant. He doesn't get buried in one of the fancy Catholic cemeteries. He gets buried on the outskirts of town. In fact, that's where the Swiss Guards ended up after the French Revolution. And so completely forgotten about. Boom. So now we build this beautiful structure for him, and we got to go find him. So by the time we figure out kind of where that cemetery was, the American ambassador to France is doing all this research, and he comes to the location, and he looks up and he's like, damn, there's buildings on top of it. So now he's got to get the rights to dig underneath, which he does. And they dig, and it looks like literally a West Virginia coal mine situation. Mm-hmm. And they start pulling out the bones from the Swiss Guard, and they start pulling out some caskets, open it up, and sure enough, they find John Paul Jones. Anybody want to see? Guys, all right. Let me use my colonial iPad here. Shh, don't say that. It's all good. All right, you sure you want to see? That's our boy. After 100 years on the ground.
There you go.
Wow. How do they know it was him?
Great question. That's a softball question. Thank you very much. Well, a couple of things. Number one, he was buried in straw soaked in alcohol. So, his body's pretty well preserved. That's 100 years old. They did some analysis, some forensic analysis, and then I'm going to show you downstairs. The pièce de résistance. So they find him. and bring John Paul Jones back over here to the States. They have a big ceremony for him in Dahlgren Hall, that first place we'll come over here. That first place we entered, we let the tour guide come down. And they finished the crypt and then buried him shortly thereafter in 1913. So let's go finish the story. Come on down.